A lot of people grow tired of their marriages, especially after a decade or two, and honestly, it's not hard to see why. But what baffles me is how some are willing to gamble everything they've built for a momentary thrill, only to find themselves in a darker place afterward. My wife was one of those people, ready to take that risk, and what followed was anything but pleasant for her. After 20 years together, my wife, still stunning at 39 and the mother of our 2 daughters, whom I absolutely adore, dropped a bombshell on me. She calmly said she had plans for a date the next evening, with a coworker. Helen and I had gotten married young, just teenagers, after a whirlwind romance that lasted less than a year. It was all sparked by her surprise pregnancy with our first daughter. Back then, our love was so strong that we took the leap and tied the knot, and 7 months later, Christy came into our world. Our marriage had been nothing short of fulfilling. It was full of love, joy, and the shared experience of raising 2 remarkable girls who always looked up to us. Meanwhile, I worked hard to build a landscaping business from the ground up, eventually growing it into a multi-million-dollar success. It gave us a good life, one filled with happiness and purpose. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd hear my wife say what she said that evening. She sat on the couch, a glass of scotch in hand, and delivered her news like it was something casual, but it hit me with the force of a freight train. She admitted she'd been struggling with depression ever since our daughters left for college, feeling unhappy and lost. In my eyes, our marriage had been perfect, which made her words cut even deeper. Helen confessed that she'd grown close to a coworker, Tommy from accounting. Apparently, he'd become her sounding board during her struggles with depression. This took me by surprise since she had never mentioned being unhappy or overwhelmed to me. It stung to hear that she turned to someone else for emotional support, but the fact that she wanted to pursue something romantic with him? That was gut-wrenching. And Tommy? Well, I knew his type. A married man with 3 little girls at home, parading around as some kind of counselor while preying on vulnerable women. Men like him have a knack for zeroing in on women going through tough times, using them until they're no longer useful. John, I can't hide this from you, Helen said, her voice trembling. I hope you can understand, but I need to do this for myself. It might sound selfish, but I need you to let me have this one night to figure things out. I felt an explosion of anger brewing inside me, but I kept it contained. Deep down, I knew Helen well enough to realize she'd already made up her mind. Once she set her sights on something, there was no talking her out of it. When she was done speaking, I just sat there, frozen, staring at her. She was curled up on the love seat across from me, fidgeting nervously. The silence between us was unbearable. I didn't say a word. I finished my scotch, got up, and headed toward the door. John, don't ignore me, she called after me. Stop acting like a child and sulking. This is happening, and I needed to tell you before it did. I'm not betraying you, I'm being honest. We've always been honest with each other, haven't we? I stopped and turned to look at her, my face probably revealing every ounce of turmoil I was feeling. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling into a ball, and I just stood there staring. Then, without a single word, I went upstairs. In our bedroom, I grabbed a bag and packed enough clothes and toiletries for a couple of days. When I came back down, Helen was still on the couch, crying softly. Please, John, she begged as I walked past her toward the garage. Don't leave. Everything will be fine, Helen had said, her voice trembling with a mix of resolve and nervousness. It's just one outing, nothing more. One evening, John. Surely, after 20 years, you can give me that much. As I drove away, her words replayed in my mind, and I couldn't help but shake my head in disbelief. That Thursday night, I decided I wasn't going to sulk in misery some way cheap and uncomfortable. No, if I was going to endure this gut-wrenching pain, I'd do it in style. So, I pulled into the Ritz-Carlton, yes, for $100 a night, but at that point, I didn't care. At least my surroundings would feel luxurious, even if everything else in my life felt like it was falling apart. Almost as soon as I checked in, the calls and texts started flooding my phone. I replied to Helen just once, telling her I wouldn't be responding again until I got back home on Saturday. Then I blocked her number. That simple act felt harsh, but after what she'd done, I had no doubt my silence would sting. The next day, while sitting at my desk, I took further steps to ensure my peace of mind. I told my secretary to block any calls from Helen and instructed building security to turn her away if she showed up unannounced. My plan was already in motion, and nothing, not even Helen, was going to derail it. Let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm John Casey, and I've always been the kind of man people turn to when things get tough. At work, I'm the one in charge, the guy who takes control and gets results. Among my friends, I'm the reliable problem solver. But at home? At home, I've been something else entirely, laid back, easygoing, and always aiming to please. I'd kept my assertive side in check for the sake of harmony. It had been my way of handling marriage for 20 years, but now I was starting to see where that approach had led me. Looking back, I realized I should have been firmer, steadier, more like the man I was in every other part of my life. I loved my wife and treated her like royalty. But now, standing in the wreckage of what I thought was a perfect marriage, I could see the consequences of my choices. I once laughed at a quote I'd heard. Treat her like a queen, and she'll treat you like a servant. Back then, it seemed like a joke. Now, it felt like my reality. But I wasn't about to let it stay that way. On Friday morning, I made a call to my brother, who's a detective down in Miami. He's the kind of guy you can rely on, and I knew he'd have the connections I needed. After explaining the situation, he set me up with Peter Cliff, one of his trusted private investigators. Peter, it's Sergeant Davis, my brother said when Peter picked up. How are you? Listen, I need a favor. My brother's in a tough spot, and he needs your help tonight. Tonight? Peter asked, his voice cautious but willing. That's short notice, Davis, but I owe you. What's the situation? My brother's wife is meeting someone, and we need to know who he is. Can you have one of your guys tail her? We need a name, a license plate, a home address, whatever you can gather by tomorrow morning. Photos can wait until Saturday. For now, just focus on identifying the man. All right, got it, Peter said. I'll need something to start with. My brother will send you her address, her departure time, and the guy's first name. His name is Tommy, and they work together at Broker Unlimited. Shouldn't be too hard to pin him down. Understood, Peter replied. I'll get on it tonight. With the wheels in motion, I felt a sense of control returning, something I hadn't felt since Helen's revelation. The wife gets home around 5. My brother continued. We're not sure exactly when her date's supposed to start, so you'll need someone outside the house before 5 to tail her the moment she heads out. Got it? Send me her address, and I'll handle the rest. I listened closely, my brother's words trailing off as the call ended. A smirk tugged at my lips. Everything was falling into place, and my plan was aligning perfectly with reality. Time wasn't on my side, though, and I knew every second counted. If Helen thought she could sneak off and play her little game unnoticed, she was sorely mistaken. While she and Tommy were out dining, I had something special in mind, visiting Tommy's wife to deliver the hard truth about her husband's infidelity and his current whereabouts. First, I reached out to Joe, an old friend of mine who'd been through his own messy divorce. Joe had taken a different approach to dealing with loneliness. He turned to services that provided companionship without the strings or drama. Back then, I didn't really understand his choice, but now it made sense. No betrayal, no emotional scars, just straightforward arrangements, likely cheaper than the fallout of a cheating spouse. Joe was quick to help, as always. Within minutes, he shared the contact details of a reputable service. I made the call and explained my situation, stressing the need for absolute discretion. I even offered an $11,000 tip. Yes, $11,000, due to the unique circumstances. I've recently separated, I explained. I'd like to meet someone, a young, attractive blonde, and keep it classy. And one more thing, it needs to look like a genuine date. If my wife happens to show up, I don't want anything about this to seem professional. The arrangements were set. I planned to meet her at my hotel for drinks first, giving us a chance to get acquainted before the evening's activities. Helen would never expect what I had up my sleeve, but if she decided to barge in after her romantic outing, she'd find me in the middle of my own. Meanwhile, Saturday rolled around. Helen, as a real estate agent, was busy hosting open houses, her usual weekend routine. She rarely made it home before 6 on Saturdays, and this day was no different. It gave me all the time I needed. Sitting in the Ritz-Carlton that morning, I thought back to Thursday night, how Helen had sat on that couch, stewing over our argument after I walked out. I can't believe he acted like such a child. She probably muttered to herself, her frustration bubbling over in that empty room. Storming out like that without even saying a word? What a jerk! She must have tried calling and texting me dozens of times, growing more irritated with every unanswered attempt. Then, at some point, one particular text from me made her pause. The word betrayal was in it, and it hit her like a slap across the face. For a moment, Helen hesitated, unsure of her next move. She started to second-guess herself, wondering if what she'd planned really was harmless fun, or something far worse. But soon enough, she brushed those doubts aside. It's just one night, she told herself, rationalizing her actions. It's not betrayal. It's just one evening to feel alive again. And with that, she doubled down on her decision, convinced she wasn't crossing any lines. John will get over it, Helen thought, brushing away any lingering doubts. He's just overreacting. By tomorrow night, he'll forgive me, and I'll make it up to him. He won't be able to resist, he never can. I know exactly how to help him move past all of this by Friday evening. Returning to the quiet, empty house, Helen paused for a moment, her plans flickering uncertainly in her mind. Should she stick with her arrangement to go out with Tommy, or cancel and call John to come home? The idea of a carefree, exciting evening pulled her back into resolve, and she decided to go ahead with her original intentions. Helen ran herself a hot bath, letting the warmth soak away her tension. She meticulously shaved her legs and smoothed on her most alluring lotion, the scent rising softly around her. Seated at her makeup table, she began transforming her naturally lovely features into something far more seductive. As she styled her long hair to perfection, she caught her reflection in the mirror and smiled with satisfaction. The woman looking back at her wasn't just Helen, she was alluring, confident, and ready for the night ahead. She reached for the new short dress she'd bought earlier that day, removing the tags and hanging it carefully on the mirror. Then, she slid on a pair of stockings, one she had never worn for John, and clipped them to the fresh garter belt she'd picked up from Nordstrom that afternoon. As her fingers lingered on the silky fabric of the stockings, an uninvited memory surfaced. She recalled how, over the years, John had occasionally asked her to dress provocatively, suggesting it might add a little spark to their marriage. And then came the sharp sting of guilt. Her mind replayed Valentine's Day, when John brought her a lingerie set from Victoria's Secret. She could still see the hurt in his eyes when she'd asked him if he thought she looked cheap in such things, rejecting his gift outright. For a long minute, Helen sat motionless, staring at the stockings she was now slipping on for another man. The contrast was striking, and for the first time, a pang of doubt pierced through her excitement. Maybe she should cancel the date. Maybe this wasn't the right thing to do. But John's words from that last text, accusing her of betrayal, echoed in her head. She shook the thought off quickly, tucking away her guilt in the back of her mind. Helen buttoned up the silk dress, deciding against a bra, and stood before the full-length mirror. Her gaze traveled over her figure, taking in her long legs, the sheen of black stockings, and the high heels she rarely wore. God, I look bold, she thought, a rush of exhilaration spreading through her. Maybe too bold. But it's thrilling. I can't wait to see Tommy's reaction. Still, she reminded herself of the boundaries she had promised to set. It's just dinner and dancing, she whispered to her reflection. Nothing more. I'm in control. Yet deep down, Helen knew how thin that line really was. For weeks, she had been caught in a web of anticipation, her thoughts revolving around this moment. John's behavior, immature as she saw it, only steeled her resolve. She convinced herself he'd let it go. He always did. That's what she loved about him, his ability to accommodate, to forgive, to smooth over life's rough edges. She cherished him for it, even as she prepared to cross a line he might never forget. As Helen finished getting ready for her evening, her phone buzzed with a call from John. It was his final attempt to stop what he felt was the inevitable unraveling of their marriage. Swallowing his pride was no easy task, but John's love for Helen ran deeper than his ego. Desperation clawed at him, pushing him to plead with her, even if it meant sacrificing his dignity to keep her by his side. Feeling the weight of her own guilt, Helen hesitated before answering. She knew her intentions weren't entirely honorable, and the sound of John's voice was sure to make her heart ache. But despite the conflict within her, she picked up. John, she began softly, her voice trembling. Thank you for calling. I miss you. I love you so much. When are you coming home, darling? Helen, I love you too, John replied, his voice thick with emotion. That's why I'm calling. My heart can't take this. I'm begging you, please don't go. Don't do this. Stay home, stay with me. I'll do whatever it takes to make you happy. If I've failed you somehow, just tell me, and I'll fix it. I'll be the man you need me to be, I promise. Just please cancel this date. Let's save what we have before it's too late. Helen listened as his voice cracked, the pain seeping through every word. A pang of sympathy washed over her, but mixed in was an odd sense of power. Her dependable, steady husband, the rock she had always relied on, was now crumbling, pleading with her not to leave. She understood how deeply he loved her, and in her heart, she was sure he would forgive her in time. After all, their years together, their children, and his unwavering devotion were bonds she believed would keep them tied forever. Oh, John, she said gently, I adore you more than you'll ever know. And I can't wait for our future together. But tonight isn't about us. It's something I need to do for myself. It's just a fleeting moment, something small, and it doesn't change how much I love you. Please, darling, trust me on this. Nothing will happen, it's just dinner and drinks with a friend. I'll come home tonight, and tomorrow we'll talk about it. I'll be yours again completely. Forever. Her voice wavered, tears brimming in her eyes as she added, I know this hurts you, and I'm sorry. But you're overreacting. Please understand. I'll be back tonight, and we'll put this behind us. John sat on the other end of the line, listening to her words, each one hitting him like a blow to the chest. Helen, please. He tried once more, his voice breaking, but she cut him off. I have to go, she whispered, the tears spilling over now. She hung up before he could say another word. Helen lowered her phone and dabbed at her eyes carefully, not wanting to ruin her makeup. She turned to her reflection in the mirror, her face a mix of guilt and defiance. He probably thinks I'm being unreasonable, she murmured to herself. But I'm sorry, John. I have to do this for me. Please don't hate me. With a deep breath, she adjusted her hair, touched up her lipstick, and sprayed her perfume. As she smoothed her dress and slipped into her heels, she tried to push the sound of John's voice out of her mind. Meanwhile, back in his hotel room, John sat frozen, staring at his phone as the call ended. His hands shook as he wiped away tears, the sting of rejection igniting a wave of anger deep within him. He had just pleaded with his wife to stay, to choose him, but she'd made her choice clear. She expected him to accept it, to support her decision even. And the very thought made his blood boil. The next morning, overwhelmed with grief, John woke to the crushing realization that he had lost the woman he had loved for over 20 years. The weight of her betrayal pressed heavily on his chest, and the memory of her dismissing his pleas the night before lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Across the street from their home, Peter, the private investigator, sat in his inconspicuous white van, parked strategically just before 5 p.m. He watched as Helen pulled into the garage. An hour later, another car entered the driveway. Peter took note of the license plate, and quickly made a few calls. Within minutes, he had all the information he needed. The address and home phone number of the car's owner were promptly sent to both Davis and John's phones, even before the couple had left for their date. Inside the house, Tommy greeted Helen with his usual charm. But as soon as he stepped inside, he noticed the sadness etched on her face, her eyes betraying her inner turmoil. Her guilt and hesitation were evident, and Tommy, being no stranger to such situations, knew how to handle it. "Helen, what's wrong?" he asked gently, sitting beside her on the couch. "You seem upset. If this is too much, we don't have to go through with it." Helen hesitated, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking about John. He called me last night, begging me not to go. I feel so guilty, like I've already betrayed him, and I can't shake it." A single tear rolled down her cheek. Tommy leaned closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. His tone was soft and reassuring. "Helen, listen to me. Everything's fine. I completely understand how you feel, and if you want to cancel tonight, I'll respect that. But remember, we're just friends. You're not doing anything wrong. Men like John, they're protective. They don't always understand friendships like ours." She looked up at him, searching for reassurance. "But it doesn't feel right, Tommy. I've never done anything like this before. It feels wrong. He smiled, tilting his head sympathetically. Then let's keep it simple. We don't have to go dancing or do anything extravagant. Let's just grab dinner. A meal between friends, there's no harm in that, right? You've already gotten all dressed up, and honestly, I've been looking forward to spending time with you. Just dinner, and then I'll take you home. I promise. Tommy's calm and casual demeanor worked its magic. Helen felt her hesitation melt away. She nodded, convincing herself it was harmless. After all, it was just dinner. She wanted to believe that was all it would be. By 7 p.m., Peter watched as the two drove off toward a downtown restaurant. He immediately relayed the update to Davis and John. Throughout the evening, Peter diligently followed them, snapping photos and recording videos that would become undeniable evidence of Helen's betrayal. Over the next 4 hours, he documented everything, the couple holding hands at dinner, leaning in close while they talked, laughing as if they shared an inside joke. He captured them walking into a dance club, their bodies pressed together on the dance floor as they moved in sync to the slow music. At one point, Tommy kissed her, his hands lingering on her hips. Peter recorded it all, sending the photos and videos to John before sunrise. By 8 p.m., John couldn't wait any longer. He picked up his phone and dialed Brian, Helen's father. Brian was more than just his father-in-law. He was a close friend and golf partner, someone John respected deeply. "Hello, Brian," John began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "John! How are you? Are we still on for golf Sunday?" "I don't know, Brian," John replied with a sigh. "I've got some bad news." "What's going on?" Brian asked, his tone shifting to concern. John took a deep breath. "Brian, I don't know how else to say this, but Helen is out with another man right now. A colleague of hers. She told me last night that she needed to do this. I begged her not to go, but she went anyway. I love her, and I love you and Maggie, but I can't accept this. Our marriage is over. She's broken the vows we made, and I can't forgive her for this." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Brian finally spoke. "Are you sure, John? That doesn't sound like my daughter. Helen wouldn't do something like this. There must be some kind of mistake." "I wish there was, Brian," John said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't want to believe it either. But I have proof. Pictures. Videos. She's out with him right now, holding hands, kissing him. I didn't want you to find out this way, but I needed you to know before things get worse. I'm sorry, Brian. I truly am." As John drove to Tommy's house that Friday night, a storm of emotions churned inside him: anger, heartbreak, and a grim sense of resolve. The private investigator had provided Tommy's home address, and John wasn't one to let the opportunity pass. He parked outside the modest 2-story home, took a deep breath, and approached the door. When a woman answered, she appeared surprised but polite. She was in her early 30s, wearing tight jeans and a delicate lace top that hugged her figure. Her warm smile faltered slightly as she noticed John's serious expression. "Good evening," John began, doing his best to maintain composure. "Are you Mrs. Brooks, Tommy's wife?" "Yes, I am," she replied, her brow furrowing. "Is everything all right? Has something happened to Tommy?" John took a moment to steady himself. "He's fine, Mrs. Brooks. He works with my wife. May I come in for a moment? There's something I need to tell you." Though puzzled, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Once inside, John turned to face her, the weight of his words already pressing down on him. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, his tone heavy with regret. "I'm truly sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I felt you needed to hear this directly. At this very moment, your husband, Tommy, and my wife are on a date." Her face twisted with disbelief. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "Tommy's out at his Friday night poker game. He does this every week with his friends." John nodded grimly. "I wish that were true, but I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain. My private investigator is watching them as we speak. They've been photographed and recorded together at dinner, and I can provide you with the evidence. I'm so sorry, but I thought you deserved to know." Her hands trembled as she brought them to her mouth, the weight of his words beginning to sink in. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Are you absolutely sure?" "I'm certain," John said firmly, though his heart ached seeing the pain in her eyes. I'll send you the evidence tonight. I didn't come here to cause you more hurt, but I thought it was better for you to know the truth now than to find out later. Stella sank onto the couch, tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. Why would he do this to me? To our family? John didn't have an answer. I'm sorry, Mrs. Brooks. Truly I am. But that's the choice Tommy made. Leaving her in tears felt cruel, but John knew there was nothing more he could say or do. As he stepped back into the night, he couldn't shake the hollow ache in his chest. 2 families, 2 lives shattered by betrayal. The next morning, John sat in his hotel room, tray of breakfast before him. The rich aroma of the hotel's signature coffee filled the air, but it did little to soothe him. Reclining in bed, he tried to find some semblance of peace as he poured himself a cup. That peace was short-lived. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from the private investigator. Opening it, John was greeted by a stream of photos and videos documenting the previous night. As he scrolled through the images, a wave of disgust and sorrow swept over him. The first photos showed Helen and Tommy at the restaurant, their heads close as they laughed and smiled. Then came the shots of them holding hands, entering the dance club, and finally, the most gut-wrenching, Tommy kissing her, his hand firmly on her lower back. John's stomach churned, his appetite vanishing. His eyes burned with unshed tears as he watched the video of their slow dance. Tommy's hands roamed freely, and Helen didn't resist. It was a betrayal that felt like a knife twisting in his chest. What hit him the hardest wasn't just the intimacy, it was the stockings. She had worn them for Tommy, something she'd never done for him. He vividly remembered Valentine's Day, when he'd brought her a gift of similar lingerie. Her response had been a curt rejection, questioning his intentions and leaving him humiliated. And yet here she was, wearing them without hesitation for another man. The humiliation and sense of inadequacy were suffocating. But as he sat there, the pain gradually gave way to anger. His love for Helen had been deep and unwavering, but her actions had severed that bond. Watching her with another man, laughing, touching, and smiling as if their life together meant nothing, it was too much to bear. John set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. He had loved her with everything he had, but now, all that remained was the cold realization that their marriage was over. Tommy persuaded Helen to extend their evening after dinner, suggesting they visit his favorite dance club. Helen hesitated, torn between her guilt and her desire to embrace this fleeting thrill. Despite her doubts, she gave in, convincing herself it was a one-time experience that would mean nothing in the long run. Unbeknownst to her, John sat in his hotel room, replaying the videos sent by the private investigator for the 3rd time. Each viewing felt like a dagger twisting deeper into his heart. The sight of Tommy's hands roaming freely over Helen's body, her laughter, her complicity, it was too much to bear. In the dim silence of his room, John finally broke, exclaiming aloud, "How could she do this?" As he wrestled with his thoughts, a grim clarity emerged. Helen might not have crossed the line physically, but her actions, the intimate dancing, the lingering touches, the stolen kisses, were undeniably a betrayal. It wasn't just a betrayal of their vows but of the deep trust and respect that had once formed the foundation of their marriage. By Saturday afternoon, John had made up his mind. At 2 p.m., he met Candy at the hotel, a woman who had agreed to assist him in carrying out a plan that was equal parts calculated and impulsive. For the next 2 hours they talked, establishing a rapport and discussing the specifics of their arrangement. Candy, with her charm and understanding demeanor, proved to be the ideal accomplice for what John had in mind. By a little after 4 p.m., John returned home with Candy in tow. They spent the next hour settling in, and by 5 p.m., they were in his bedroom. The plan wasn't about revenge in the conventional sense. It was about reclaiming control and sending Helen an unambiguous message about the consequences of her choices. Before retiring for the evening, John took the time to compose a letter. He poured his thoughts onto the page, the words carrying a mix of sorrow, anger, and finality. Helen. Last night, you broke not only our marital vows but also my heart. While we remain legally married, I no longer consider us bound by our contract. You have your freedom, and now I reclaim mine. I'll be taking the master bedroom as this is my house. You're welcome to stay, but any other room is yours, my bed is off limits. Your belongings have been moved to the guest room. I trust you'll respect my space moving forward. May you find comfort in your choices and the life you've chosen. This is goodbye to the man I was for you. Your former husband, John. John folded the letter neatly and placed it on the entrance door. Removing his wedding ring, he pressed it against the note, driving one of his collector knives through the ring and into the wood. It was a stark, deliberate gesture, one he knew Helen couldn't ignore. By the time Helen returned home later that evening, the sight on the door stopped her in her tracks. Her breath hitched as she took in the knife embedded in the wood, pinning the letter and the wedding ring in place. Anxiety surged through her veins, her heart pounding as she scanned her surroundings, half expecting some further sign of chaos. Summoning her courage, she approached the door and gingerly removed the knife, the letter trembling in her hands as she unfolded it. With each word, tears streamed down her face, her chest tightening as the full weight of John's message sank in. The wedding ring, now tarnished in her mind by the blade that pierced it, seemed to burn in her palm. Clutching the letter and ring, Helen hurried inside, frantically searching for John. Her voice cracked as she called out, "John! John, please!" The house was eerily quiet, the hallway dimly lit and empty. Her sobs echoed through the stillness as she wandered from room to room, desperate to find him. "John, I'm sorry! Please don't leave me! We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes," she cried, her words dissolving into broken pleas. But the silence persisted, offering no comfort, no absolution. For the first time, Helen was forced to confront the reality of her choices, and the hollowness they had left in the life she had once shared with John. The house was silent, save for faint noises filtering from the bedroom upstairs. Helen's heart pounded as she ascended the stairs, dread and anger swirling within her. Pausing outside the door, she strained to make sense of the sounds. Unable to resist, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The sight that greeted her shattered whatever composure she had left. John lay in bed with another woman, their intimacy unmistakable. Her emotions erupted like a tidal wave. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "You're despicable, John!" Tears streamed down her face as she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She fled down the stairs, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the house. Blinded by anger and heartbreak, Helen sped through the dark streets to her sister Mary's house. Her thoughts raced as fast as her car. How could John do this? When she arrived, Mary opened the door to find her sister disheveled and in tears. Without waiting for an invitation, Helen stepped inside and collapsed onto the couch, her sobs shaking her body. "Helen, what happened?" Mary asked, wrapping an arm around her. After a moment, Helen managed to compose herself enough to speak. "I found John, with someone else. In our bed," she stammered. I don't even know. Lost. Angry. Broken." Mary frowned, her disbelief evident. "That doesn't sound like John at all. I've never known him to be anything but devoted to you. He adored you, Helen. Honestly, I envied the way he treated you, the love, the respect. Are you sure? This doesn't add up. Did something happen to trigger this?" Helen wiped her eyes and stared at the floor. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe it's because I went on a date last night. That's the only explanation I can think of." Mary's eyes widened. "You what? What do you mean you went on a date? It wasn't like that," Helen said defensively. "It was just dinner and dancing with a colleague. It wasn't romantic." Mary's tone turned sharp. "Helen, let me get this straight. You went out with another man last night, had dinner and danced with him, while your husband, who's always been crazy about you, stayed home? Am I understanding this correctly?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. "Well, yes. But you're making it sound worse than it was." Mary threw her hands up in exasperation. "Are you out of your mind? Did you honestly think John would be okay with that? That he'd see it as innocent fun?" Helen's voice broke as she tried to justify herself. "I told him it wasn't anything intimate. I thought he'd understand." Mary shook her head. "Good Lord, Helen. You're so naive, it's hard to believe we're related. Now I understand why he had someone else in your bed. And honestly, I don't blame him." Helen's tears flowed freely as she pulled the note from her pocket, the one John had left on the door. She handed it to Mary, who read it in silence. "Oh, Helen," Mary finally said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "You've really messed up this time. What you did was selfish and foolish. You may have cost yourself your husband and your marriage. And from the looks of it, he's already moved on." Mary sighed deeply. "You can stay here tonight, but tomorrow, you need to go back and face him. Try to fix this, though I wouldn't get my hopes up. I'll message him and see if he's willing to talk, but you'd better prepare for the worst. If I'd pulled a stunt like this, Tom would have kicked me out on the spot. And John? He's even more principled than my husband." Helen spent the night in Mary's guest room, crying into her pillow until her tears ran dry. Sleep eluded her, the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. Meanwhile, Mary texted John, urging him to call her when he had a moment. John, ever respectful of Mary and her no-nonsense demeanor, called back within the hour. "Hey, Mary," John said, his voice steady. "What's going on?" "Hi, John," Mary began. "Helen's here. She told me what happened tonight. I have to say, I don't blame you one bit. Honestly, your response was pretty swift." John let out a low chuckle. "Well, you know me, Mary. I don't tolerate nonsense." His voice softened slightly. "I assume she's crying her eyes out over there?" "She is," Mary confirmed. "And while I'm furious with her, she's still my sister. I'm trying to figure out if there's any way to salvage this." "Do you even want to talk to her?" John hesitated. "I don't know, Mary. She crossed a line I didn't think she ever would. This wasn't just about the date, it was about trust. She broke that. And once trust is gone..." Mary sighed. "I get it. I do. But maybe just hear her out. If for no other reason than closure?" "I'll think about it," John said after a pause. "Thanks for reaching out, Mary. I'll let you know." As he hung up, John stared out the window, his emotions a swirling mix of anger, sadness, and resolve. For the first time, he began to envision a future without Helen, and the thought didn't hurt as much as he expected. Mary's voice crackled with concern as she spoke one last time. "I understand she made a mistake, John, but she's struggling so much. I can't cope with seeing her like this. You both need to have a conversation about this tomorrow. I'm not sure if you're actually going to kick her out, and I wouldn't blame you if you did. But if she hasn't gone through with this guy yet, maybe there's still hope. Perhaps you could try therapy, or maybe even some kind of treatment to help Helen work through her issues. Please let her come back tomorrow. Let her talk to you." John took a deep breath, his thoughts drifting between the hurt he felt and the numbness that had settled into his chest. "Of course she can come back, Mary," he said quietly. "This is still her home. I didn't evict her. But she won't be staying here while she's under my roof. My anger has faded, replaced by something deeper: hurt. Betrayal. I'm not sure what the future holds, but right now, it feels impossible to go back to how things were. She's made it clear to me that she has no respect for the vows we took. I loved her, God, I did, but I'm not sure I can ever feel that way again." Mary, ever the voice of reason, sighed on the other end. "I get it, John. I do. Just remember she loves you. I hope, for her sake, she didn't go too far with the guy she was with." John's voice softened a little, but there was still a coldness to it. "Tell Mary to head home whenever she's ready. I'll deal with Helen. Thanks for understanding. And I love you too, sis. Goodbye." The next day, Sunday at noon, John returned from the gym, his muscles sore but his mind sharper than it had been in days. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Helen's car parked in its usual spot. A heavy knot formed in his stomach as he walked through the front door. There she was, sitting at the kitchen table, her attempt at a smile barely masking the anxiety in her eyes. "You know we're not headed for divorce, right?" Helen said, her voice shaky. "We can resolve this because we love each other." John didn't respond immediately. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the warm steam filling his nostrils, then sat down across from her. She rubbed her hands nervously in her lap. He met her gaze, his heart a twisted mess of emotions. After a few sips of coffee, he finally spoke. "That's fine by me, Helen. Divorce or not, it doesn't matter now. Once you broke our marital vows, our marriage ended. I don't see us as a couple anymore." Helen flinched, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but John raised his hand, signaling for her to listen. you're free to do whatever you want now. If you want to date other men, fine. Just like me. The only thing that's changed is this: there will be no intimacy between us. Not anymore. You gave that up the night you went out with him. Helen's eyes widened. He's not my boyfriend, and nothing happened between us, John. John's voice was calm but cutting. You went on a date with another man, Helen. You dressed provocatively, had dinner, held hands, let him touch you, kissed him, and spent hours with him. You didn't see it as a betrayal, but I do. That's where it ended for me. Helen's face crumpled in disbelief. John, I didn't mean to hurt you. It was just one night. It was nothing. You have to understand. John shook his head slowly. I understand just fine. To you, maybe it's insignificant. But to me, it's everything. You broke our marriage. And now, whether we stay married or not, things are different. I'm not the man you married anymore. Helen's voice cracked. I don't want a divorce. I want us to work this out. Please, John, I'll come back to you. Just give me time. I'll make it right. John laughed bitterly. You want time? Time to what, Helen? To decide if you'll keep running around with other men while pretending it didn't happen? You don't get to make those decisions anymore. Not when you've already chosen someone else. Helen's eyes were wide with panic. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please. John, don't do this. Don't end us like this. I'm not ending anything. John said coldly. You already did when you agreed to go out with him. You left our marriage the moment you got into his car. Don't ask me to save it now. I have no intention of giving up on Candy. She's young, attractive, and a hell of a lot easier to be around than someone who doesn't respect me. I'm not going to pretend I don't want her. Helen's face turned pale, the weight of his words crashing down on her. Fine. She whispered, defeated. But you still love me, right? John stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't promise you anything. Love's not something I feel for you anymore. Maybe I will again, but not today. Not now. The tension in the room was suffocating, each word John spoke only pushing Helen further from him. The future seemed uncertain, and the road ahead was jagged with hurt, betrayal, and unspoken regrets. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the pain they were both struggling to understand. John took a slow, deliberate breath, watching Helen's face twist with anger and shame as she tried to digest his words. He let the silence hang between them for a moment before continuing. She's also incredibly passionate, he said, his tone deliberate, as if savoring the truth of the words. I must admit, the best I've ever had. We explored things you never offered me, and now I realize what I've been missing. Why on earth would I give that up? You might not be aware of this yet, Helen, but while you were with your boyfriend last night, I paid a visit to his wife, Stella. Did you know they have 3 beautiful children? Helen's face flushed as she tried to avoid eye contact, but John pressed on. Stella shared some details about Mr. Nice Guy. Did you know you're the 3rd woman he's been caught with in the past year? And the last one, Jessica Wilson from your office? She's the one whose marriage he destroyed, just like he's trying to destroy mine now. His track record is impressive, but I'm not sure that's something you should be proud of. Stella told me she's had enough, finally realized that once a cheater, always a cheater. Looks like you're in that category now too. So how does it feel, Helen? You helped break up 2 families and 5 kids. Quite the accomplishment. Helen's face drained of color as the weight of his words sank in. She recoiled, her mind racing, realizing for the first time just how deeply Tommy had hurt others, and now, how she had done the same. Her own anger surged in response, the fury now turning inward at her own foolishness. She felt humiliated, used by Tommy, but mostly by herself. John, he's not my boyfriend, she shouted, her voice trembling. You need to stop saying that. I can't believe you went to her house and told her he was cheating on her. My God, it was only dinner. You're truly cruel and heartless. And what about you being with another woman in our home? It's unforgivable. It has to end. John stood there, unmoving, his eyes cold. Only dinner? Have you forgotten about the dirty dancing, the kissing, the touching at the club? You don't get to downplay what you did, Helen. You betrayed me. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with deliberate slowness. I promised Stella copies of all the photos and videos. Evidence she can use when Tommy tries to pass it off as nothing. I understand you don't see it as cheating, but the rest of the world will. You crossed a line that you can't come back from. And when will you understand that? When will you grasp what you did? Helen's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind spinning. So, you think I'm cruel and heartless? I get it now. But you want to know what I think about your actions? How would you describe what you did? Does it make you feel good to be with another woman in our home? You say I've betrayed you, but what about you? John's gaze never wavered. Loving and caring? No, I won't give up my time with Candy. She doesn't break my heart or disrespect me. And if you can't accept that, then you don't have to stay here. Helen's eyes burned with fresh tears, her anger mixing with desperation. No, John. I want you to end things with her. I want you to be with me. I won't see anyone else, I promise. John let out a bitter laugh. Promises? That's what you're offering me now? After everything? You think I'm supposed to just let it go because you're sorry, because you're promising not to see anyone else? That doesn't work like that, Helen. The room was thick with tension as they stared at each other, her pleading, him resolute. The marriage they'd once known, the love they'd shared, felt like an echo in a distant place, and no matter how hard Helen tried to bring it back, John couldn't seem to reach for it anymore. You can't promise me anything that will undo what's already been done. John continued, his voice softer now, but the hurt still laced in every word. And frankly, I'm not sure I even care anymore. You've already shown me who you really are, and I've seen enough. It's over, Helen. I'm done. The words hung between them, and for a moment, all she could do was stare at him, helpless, her heart breaking into pieces she wasn't sure how to put back together. John stood with his arms crossed, eyes locked on Helen, as her desperate pleas filled the air. His voice remained cold, detached, and unwavering as he responded. Oh, how amusing! You pledged to be my wife, forsaking all others, but that promise went out the window, didn't it, Helen? So as I see it, if you're not happy with the situation, you're free to leave. You can file for divorce if you want. Maybe you and your lover can shack up together, since he'll need a new place too. You two seem well suited for each other, don't you think? He let out a mocking chuckle. Or you can always move in with your sister Mary. I'm sure she'd welcome you with open arms, setting such a fine example for her daughters. Helen's face flushed with fury, but John's words cut through the anger, leaving her speechless for a moment. She struggled to compose herself. John, are you going to end things with that woman? Her voice cracked. Don't you care about me? Don't you want us to reconcile and be together? His gaze didn't waver, the pain and disillusionment still visible beneath the anger. Helen, it's too late for that now. The moment you expressed your desire for another man, you shattered me. Do I still love you? Yes, but trust is in short supply now. It's hard to trust and love someone who can discard me so easily. A real man wouldn't stand for his wife being with another man, yet you made that choice. You made it clear that you were going to pursue a relationship outside of our marriage, regardless of my feelings. John leaned in slightly, his voice quieter but no less intense. Now that you've opened up our marriage, you'll have to contend with my desires too. And right now, I desire to be with Candy, a young woman who fulfills my needs in ways I never imagined. Seeing me happy with another woman, well, that doesn't sit well with you, does it? Now you understand some of my pain, and you'll experience the consequences of your actions. Payback's a piece of shit, but tough luck, Helen. He took a breath, standing up straighter, the finality of his words cutting through the tension like a knife. As for divorce, that's your decision. We can continue living together as roommates, and see how things unfold, or you can give me the green light, and I'll have divorce papers drawn up within a week. It's your call, sweetheart. It makes no difference to me. Helen stood motionless, a storm of emotion swirling within her. She understood the gravity of what he was saying. For once, she wisely chose not to challenge him, her voice quiet with resignation as she turned away. The weeks that followed were marked by an unsettling new routine. John brought Candy home every weekend, and they shared a bed, engaging in a physical relationship that, though intensely satisfying, left John with a growing sense of emptiness. Helen's resentment simmered beneath the surface, and she did everything in her power to avoid being around when Candy was there. Saturdays became a blur of tension. Helen would leave, only returning after Candy was gone. John had made arrangements with Helen to text her when Candy left, and although he relished the physical connection with Candy and saw it as a form of retaliation against Helen's betrayal, there was an underlying discomfort that gnawed at him. Despite the pleasure, the connection with Candy felt hollow. It was purely physical, and there was no emotional depth to their interactions. The excitement and novelty began to fade, replaced by a sense of growing detachment. But it wasn't just the lack of emotional fulfillment that troubled John. The financial costs of maintaining this new arrangement with Candy were also weighing on him. He had always been careful with his money, but now, between the weekend outings, gifts, and constant attention, the strain was becoming noticeable. As the weeks passed, John found himself caught between the allure of his new, carefree relationship with Candy and the nagging guilt that lingered in his conscience. He began to wonder whether this path, filled with temporary pleasures and momentary victories, was truly the answer to the betrayal he'd experienced, or if it was just a desperate attempt to fill a void that, despite his best efforts, seemed impossible to satisfy. Deep down, John knew that while Candy offered him fleeting satisfaction, it couldn't replace what he had lost with Helen. And the cost, both emotional and financial, was starting to feel like a burden he wasn't sure he wanted to carry much longer. When Helen returned on Sunday evening, her eyes red and tired from the emotional toll of the past few days, I made my decision clear. I wouldn't see Candy for the foreseeable future. I told Helen that I was open to finding another romantic partner, but it was clear this wasn't a moment of clarity or reconciliation, it was a test. The pain from her betrayal was still too fresh, and despite everything, I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. Helen collapsed onto the couch, her voice breaking as she begged. "John, you've caused me enough suffering. Every week, I had to watch her walk through that door, knowing she was with the man I love. It's unbearable. I can't stand the thought of you with another woman. Please, John, give me another chance." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling as she continued. "I may not be able to compete with someone like her, but I swear I can offer you love. I can give you something that no one else can offer." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I didn't know how to respond. Love? What did she really understand about love? Was she offering me love, or was this just another plea to avoid the consequences of her actions? "Love?" I asked, my voice low. "Do you even comprehend what love is, Helen? Love isn't abandoning your partner to chase after other men. No, I doubt you truly understand it, which means you can't give me what you don't possess." The bitterness in my words hung in the air between us, but I wasn't done. "Here's what I'll do. I won't date anyone else, not yet. But I'm not just going to forgive you and go back to how things were. We need couples counseling. If we can work through our issues, then maybe, just maybe, there's a future for us. But that's not a guarantee." Helen sprang from the couch, rushing toward me with desperation in her eyes. She threw herself into my arms, pressing her lips all over my face before landing a long, lingering kiss on my lips. Thank you, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise I'll make things right. I swear I will." But I pulled back, my eyes cold. "Not so fast, Helen. I'm not ready to forgive you, not yet. What I'm offering is one final chance, not a blank slate. I'm only giving us an opportunity to fix this before I end it for good. If we can't work through this, if you don't truly change, then we're done." Her face crumpled, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she clung to me, desperate. "John, don't talk like that. You love me, I know you do. We can fix this. We'll always be together." I shook my head, the images of her with that man still haunting me. "I'm not ready, Helen. I can't just erase what happened. I still see you with him. I still hear you laughing, touching him, kissing him. These are things that should have been mine, and they still torment me. The thought of you with him, betraying me, it hurts in ways I can't even explain. And I'm angry, Helen, angry about how you've destroyed everything we built. You've discarded our marriage like it didn't even matter." She flinched at my words, but I continued. "You're lucky our children don't know. I can't imagine what they'd think of their mother now. You've hurt me in ways I'm not sure I can ever heal from." Helen's tears fell harder, but I couldn't let her manipulate me into thinking everything could just be fixed with a few promises. "I'm still angry, Helen. And I can't forget what you did. We need to take things slow, and the first step is counseling. If we're going to have any chance at repairing this, We'll have to do it the right way. I made the appointment with Dr. Madison for that Tuesday, and over the next 3 months, we revisited the pain, the anger, and the lies in those weekly sessions. The process wasn't easy, and it was draining. But every week, Helen and I took turns talking about what had happened, about our fractured marriage, about her betrayal, and about whether or not there was any chance for us to rebuild. There were moments of hope, but there were also moments where it felt like we were only growing farther apart. But I stayed. For her. For us. And for the possibility of healing, though it felt like a fragile thread I wasn't sure could hold. The therapy sessions became a familiar routine, one I had come to dread. It felt like an endless cycle of confronting the same painful memories, hearing the same words of remorse, and enduring hours of what seemed like pointless psychobabble. Life would have been simpler if she had just remained faithful to our vows, but that was clearly too much to ask. 3 months into bi-weekly counseling, we finally reached a point where we could, at least on the surface, resolve our issues. Helen admitted the depth of the pain she'd caused me, and she understood why I reacted the way I did. She argued that my retaliation had been even worse, but I wasn't willing to back down. I made it clear that she had violated our agreement the moment she accepted a date with another man, and in doing so, she gave me my freedom. Eventually, she understood, though she didn't like it. The counselor tried to take me to task for seeking revenge, but I wasn't interested in his judgment. If I had to do it all over again, I would. I didn't owe Helen forgiveness just because she apologized. Eventually, we settled on a post-nuptial agreement. It wasn't romantic or full of trust, but it was practical. In the event of another affair, she would forfeit everything. I insisted on a GPS tracker on her phone, full access to her emails and text messages, and a pledge of complete honesty from her, no excuses, no evasion. I made it clear, one slip up, emotional or physical, and she'd be out. There would be no second chances. Helen agreed, swearing that she would never flirt with another man again and would be faithful to me, for better or worse. Still, the warning from Stella echoed in my mind, once a cheater, always a cheater. A year later, I found myself back in that uncomfortable territory. I kept a closer watch on her, knowing that history has a way of repeating itself. Together with Mary, her sister, we kept a watchful eye, hoping that the lessons had stuck. Tommy's life had unraveled completely. His wife kicked him out, kept the house, and secured child support and alimony for their 3 kids. He was now living in a cramped studio apartment, struggling to make ends meet after paying the price for his infidelity. The irony wasn't lost on me. Tommy lost everything over a dinner, a few dances, some flirting, and a few kisses. How could someone be so foolish? Helen was devastated when she discovered Tommy's history of infidelity. She learned that he'd been involved in multiple affairs, including with Jennifer Wilson, the woman from her office, whose marriage had ended because of Tommy. It made Helen realize how close she had come to destroying her own life, to losing everything she held dear, her marriage, her family's love, because of her own naivety. Determined never to make the same mistake again, Helen promised to show me, and our children, unwavering love and loyalty. She stuck to her word, never wavering, never even allowing the thought of another man to cross her mind. But deep down, she knew the image of another woman beside her husband would always haunt her. She believed I was hers and no one else's. Tommy's affair with a married woman had cost him dearly, but there was a darker side to his actions. Had he pursued his affair with Jennifer further, the consequences could have been far more dangerous. Thankfully, I wasn't the type to act out of vengeance. But had things gone differently, the repercussions might have been disastrous. The irony of betrayal is that those who are wronged never forget. And sometimes, they find a way to seek justice. 2 years after his divorce, Jennifer's ex-husband, the betrayed man, crossed paths with Tommy in the parking lot outside Helen's workplace. Later that evening, Tommy was found unconscious in the pub, severely injured. No one knew who had done it, but I couldn't help but wonder, had Tommy finally learned his lesson? As a wise man once said, the scars on my heart weren't left by my enemies, but by those who claimed to love me.